Right, so today I want to address the hypocrisy that we have as Africans. All of a sudden, in the past 2 weeks, we have seen South Africans being denounced. Their politicians, the president, the police, and South Africans being named inhumane for killing fellow Africans through the protests that have been taking place in South Africa. People have been saying that the South African government is encouraging foreigners to be killed, particularly black foreigners. They've been saying that politicians are the ones that are creating an environment of impunity for Africans to be killed in this country based on their identity and where they come from. But I want to say that this is hypocrisy. It is hypocrisy to hear our civil society groups, our church leaders, our politicians, and our pressure groups denouncing South Africans for violence that is being done by the poor against the poor, violence being done by groups that are targeting smaller groups of foreigners in a country that is laden with poverty. And yet, some of the people that are denouncing these South Africans, countries like Zimbabwe, we have got opposition members, civil society groups, white Rhodesians that went out to the United States, the countries that enslaved us, the countries that imposed colonialism on us, the countries that are still imposing neo-colonialism on us, and they asked them for sanctions. Sanctions that were going to target 16 million Zimbabweans to ensure that it destroys the government's ability to give services to those Zimbabweans, destroys the hospital system to ensure that many Zimbabweans would be deprived of medical care, deprived of services, deprived of social services, so that hundreds of thousands would be killed by these sanctions. They've ensured that they've gone to the Europeans to call for sanctions that target their own people over the past 18 years to ensure that businesses are destroyed, ensure that infrastructure is destroyed, institutions are destroyed, and ensure that many Zimbabweans die, and those who remain will be displaced into being refugees into countries like South Africa. That is the Zimbabwean. They hate themselves so much that they will call for sanctions upon their own people to kill hundreds of thousands, not 10, not 15 like we're seeing in the xenophobic attacks, but hundreds of thousands at a go, and that millions will be sent into being refugees in countries like South Africa. And those Zimbabweans will tell you that no, they're coming into South Africa because Zimbabwe is corrupt. They're coming into South Africa because there is political violence in Zimbabwe. But they forget that they come into a country where the corruption is so high that in a country where 54 people are murdered every single day, less than 10% of those cases are solved because of the fact that police officers and prosecutors and judges are selling dockets and they are corrupt about how it is that they solve the cases. Every 4 minutes, a woman is raped in this country, and those cases are not solved because the corruption in this country has it so much that those cases will be sold, and dockets will be sold, and prosecutors will be paid to ensure that those cases are not solved. You talk about political violence in this country. Just in KwaZulu-Natal, more than 93 politicians, I'm not talking about supporters, I'm talking about politicians in office, councillors, have been killed. And they've been killed in this country. How many have been killed in Zimbabwe? But South Africans don't call for sanctions upon their own country. South Africans do not say because more than 400 women are raped in jail cells, in police stations every single year, they're going to call for sanctions upon their own. In service level protests, people are killed by police almost on a daily basis, but we do not hear the South Africans calling for sanctions upon themselves. But the Zimbabwean, out of self-hate, out of hate of his own brothers, went to call for the Europeans and Americans, the ex-colonizers, the ex-enslavers, to put sanctions upon his own people. Then you want the South African to watch your life much more than you watch your own life. You want the South African to care about your life much more than you care about your own people. I don't believe that any xenophobic violence, short of a genocide, would kill more people than how many Zimbabweans have been killed by sanctions called upon them by other Zimbabweans. And while all this is happening, our civil society groups are silent. The church is saying nothing about sanctions. The church is saying nothing about denouncing the inhumanity of politicians in our country going to call for sanctions that kill and target 16 million people to kill hundreds of thousands of them and displace millions of them into being refugees. None of our civil society groups, pressure groups, lawyers groups, or any professionals talk about the sanctions in Zimbabwe, but they have a nerve to talk about how South Africans hate foreigners. That is nonsense. Zimbabweans are suffering more because of what has been done to them by fellow Zimbabweans, much more than they suffer what has been done to them by South Africans. This is why Zimbabweans have become refugees from Zimbabwe and not running away from South Africa, where they say xenophobia is taking place. Our self-hate is the biggest problem we have in Zimbabwe. And maybe South Africans don't know how to deal with that issue. They don't know how to ventilate their frustration of Zimbabwean activists that are sitting comfortably in South Africa. People like Morgan Tsvangirai, who will sit in the hospital system of South Africa and call for more sanctions to destroy the hospitals in his own country so that his countrymen do not have hospitals and they end up coming as refugees into South Africa. Maybe South Africans don't know how to deal with hypocrites who sit in a foreign country and allow the destruction of what was one of the best medical systems in Africa. When Zimbabwe got independence for 25 years, they were now being destroyed by the sanctions that are being called on by fellow Zimbabweans. This hypocrisy must end. This is the kind of hypocrisy that we as Africans must unite to denounce. South Africans don't call for sanctions upon their own country, irrespective of how much pain they go through. They don't call for sanctions upon their own politicians for corruption. Why is it that Zimbabweans have gotten away with it for so long and then have the nerve to denounce or to say anything negative about the South African government and how it's handling its affairs around xenophobia? End the hypocrisy. Zimbabweans united against sanctions is dedicated to end sanctions in Zimbabwe, and therefore this hypocrisy and other types of hypocrisies are what we are fighting until we free ourselves and are able to free fellow Africans.